Good afternoon, my Charles Street family, or again, I should say good morning to many of you. You're probably just waking up. Today is Wednesday, August 10th, 2022, and I am blessed along with you to be alive once again, graced by God to live another day of His great creation. Today, I'm speaking to you not from any of the ancient sites in Israel. No, I'm not at the old city. I'm not at none of the great walls. I'm not in Bethlehem. I'm not even in Jerusalem. But I'm in Tel Aviv in my hotel room, where I just want to speak to you for a few minutes and give you a brief overview of Israel, its history, and its current day conflicts and tensions with the Palestinian people. The overview that I'm going to give you is not scholarly. I do not pretend to be an Israeli scholar. Far from it. I'm just a layperson or an American, African-American clergy person who has spent now a total of 6 weeks, if you include the 4 weeks that just passed or that will come to an end as of today, and 2 weeks that Reverend Barbara and I were here 5 years ago. I've seen a lot. I've read a lot. I've spoken to a lot of people. I've witnessed a lot. And even as much as I have learned, still I remain confused in so many ways, as so many other millions of people do, because this is a very complicated situation. The Israeli-Palestinian tension, it's not a pretty situation. It's not a Sunday morning rose garden situation full of terror, horror. Thousands and thousands have been killed, have been oppressed. And there is no complete innocence on either side. And so I'm going to try to be as objective, but as truthful as possible. And I hope that you will bear with it. And again, it's so good to see you. I can't wait to see you in just a matter of hopefully a few days. But here it is. The story of Israel. How did it begin? We believe as Christians, as the people of the Jewish faith believe, that it began with God telling Abram to leave his homeland of and go to a place where he will give him and where he will become the father of many nations and many people. He'll be the father of a great nation. And so Abram left with his family, with his wife Sarah and other members of his family, and he settled in the land. We also know that after Abram and then his son Isaac, and Abram had another son Ishmael, and then after Isaac came Jacob and Esau and Joseph, where the people of the descendants of Abraham lived for many years. Centuries later, when the Jews were enslaved in Egypt, God sent Moses to free them and to take them to a land that would be known as Canaan, a land full of milk and honey, a land where they will become God's people and He will be their God. And so they settled in that land, and over the next many centuries, they were attacked by neighboring countries, by enemy nations. The Assyrians came and attacked them from the north. And then a century or so later, the Babylonians came and placed them in exile. And many Jews had to move to Babylon. But they were promised through the words of the prophets, the words that God gave these prophets, that they would one day return back to their land. I'd like to fast forward so that we can quickly get to the current situation in Israel. So after they returned from Babylon to rebuild the walls and the temple, for the next several centuries, Israel continued to be attacked by various foreign enemies, the Romans, who were there for a while, and it was under the Roman Empire that the second temple was destroyed, and then this began also the Jewish diaspora when many of the Jews of Israel left Israel and moved out to the various nations of the world. This is after the time of Jesus. And the land that some of the Jews remained, that we knew of as ancient Israel, continued to be attacked by the Crusaders, by the Muslims, by the Ottoman Empire, all the way up to the next almost 2,000 years. But by this time, most of the Jews had settled in Europe and in many of the other countries in the nation, including some of the Middle East nations. Starting in the 19th century, a movement began in Europe known as the Zionist movement. Zionism, which came from the word Zion, as you will remember in Jerusalem. In the Bible, there's a hill of ancient Jerusalem known as Zion. And so the many Jews in Europe and all throughout the world began believing from a Zionist perspective that it was God's will for them to return back to their land, the land that God had given them, that hill, and not just the hill in Jerusalem, that was just symbolic, but the entire land that once the Lord had given to them, that it was their desire to return back to the land. And so this Zionist movement began, and it grew and it grew. Alongside of this Zionist movement in the first half of the 20th century came an era when Jews, particularly in Europe, began to be up under heavy persecution and oppression in the many nations where they lived, particularly in Germany with the rise of Adolf Hitler, who under his regime, 6 million Jews were killed in what we know of as the Holocaust. 6 million because they were Jewish. But it wasn't just in Germany. There were other countries, Austria, Russia, and several other countries where Jews were persecuted, where Jews were oppressed, Jews were imprisoned, Jews were denied basic human rights, and Jews were killed. And so the movement of Zionism grew and grew with many other supporters around the world. And it was in 1948 when the newly created United Nations drew up a plan that would create this new state known as Israel. It would refer and it would use the current country of Palestine. And actually, the plan called for the creation of two states, one Israel and one Palestine, where the Israelites or the people of Israel would live peacefully in their country, and the Palestinians, mostly Arabs, would live peacefully and govern themselves in their country. So this was the land that the United Nations drew up. Actually, it existed as Palestine. And there were millions of people who were already living on that land. A few Jews in the tens of thousands, and maybe it grew into a little over 100,000, but most of the people who lived in that land and in this land in 1948, at the time of the UN United Nations plan, were Arabs. people who lived there for years and years, who for generations and generations owned their land and their homes and had established business and lived their lives. And now they were told that their land would be turned over and be recreated to a new sovereign state known as Israel. And the truth is that the way it was done was not the prettiest and certainly was in many ways horrifying. Hundreds of thousands of Arabs were expelled from their homes, literally moved out by the newly created Israeli military, and they were forced out of their homes. Many were promised that they would have to leave, but once the process would complete, they would be able to return back to their homes. And that did not happen. And so there were hundreds of thousands of Arabs who were displaced, who fled as refugees to some of the neighboring countries, like in Jordan, and also Syria up here, and then Lebanon, and then many fled to Egypt. And they went to these countries, these other Arab countries, as refugees, never really fully welcomed by these neighboring countries, because they wanted them to live as the refugees ultimately wanted as well, to live in their own land, their land of Palestine, the land where they had lived for centuries and centuries, and a land that was now taken away from them, from this newly created state known as Israel. As I shared earlier, Israel, as a modern state created in 1948 by the United Nations Charter, has been a country that has endured over 70 years of bloody conflicts and wars, and many people being killed as it fought continually against the Palestinians, both living in Israel and the surrounding Arab nations, all who thought that their land was taken away, their cities and their possessions and their peoplehood in some ways were deprived because of this new modern state of Israel. And so there were at least 7 wars that were fought with Israel against its Arab neighbors from 1948 into current time. And I won't go over all of the wars, but 2 of the wars that were very key. First, immediately after Israel declared its independence in 1948, the following year became the Arab-Israeli War. And this war involved several Arab nations, that is Lebanon and Syria and Jordan and Egypt and Iraq, which is not on the map, but it's a little east of Syria. But these 5 nations all teamed up and attacked Israel and fought Israel with one purpose, and that is to regain the territory that was taken away from them from their Arab sisters and brothers who had lived in Palestine, many of them who fled into their countries. Israel miraculously won that war as it fought against its 5 Arab nations. And Israel also took that opportunity to seize additional territory that was not originally planned in the United Nations Charter. It's important to note, and I want to share that Israel won that war without the United States military or economic aid. U.S. aid to Israel, which is a reality, but it did not occur until in the 1960s. So this first war that Israel fought in 1949 against its five neighboring Arab nations was fought without military assistance from the United States. And Israel won that war and consequently seized additional territory. The next major war that Israel engaged with its Arab neighbors was a very historic one, known to many as the SixDay War, that took place in 1967. Called the SixDay War because it literally took only 6 days. It began when Syria attacked Israel, and then Syria was also joined with Jordan and with Egypt. These three countries on the margin of Israel attacked Israel. And in 6 days, Israel was able to defeat the three nations in conquering them. And at the end of this war, Israel not only won the war, but Israel expanded even additional territory that was not part of the United Nations initial plan. And I'm going to try to outline these areas. So up here in the north, known as the Golan Heights, which was initially part of Lebanon and Syria, Israel seized some land from that area, known as the Golan Heights. It also, in Egypt, going down, it took part of what is known as the Mount Sinai Peninsula. Israel took a chunk of that. Israel also took from Egypt what is today known as the Gaza Strip. And we'll talk about that in a few minutes. And then from Jordan, Israel occupied and seized much of the West Bank. It's called the West Bank because it's the west of the Jordan River and Dead Sea and Jordan. And it also includes Jerusalem and Bethlehem and some of the other areas. And so Israel, at the end of the 6-day war in 1967, was able to occupy 4 additional lands and territories that was not initially a part of the Israel that the United Nations had envisioned. When Israel seized these 4 properties, they occupied them militarily and governmentally. They occupied them, and they built settlements where they created land and they built homes for hundreds of thousands of Jews, Israeli citizens to relocate and to move there. As a result, in all 4 of these territories occupied by Israel, many of the Palestinians and the Arabs who lived in these areas were again evicted. They had to move. They were forced to relocate, and they fled to some of the other Arab nations in Egypt, in Jordan, in Syria, in Lebanon. And this is what happened, unfortunately, in 1967, with Israel expanding, taking over 4 additional lands that people lived on for centuries and centuries. And Israel occupied them, and Israel created hundreds and hundreds of settlements, neighborhoods that they developed for the Israeli citizens. Since the 1967 Six-Day War, there have been other conflicts. In 1973, there was a major conflict that occurred when Israel was attacked on its holiest day, known as Yom Kippur. But since then, Israel has been able to negotiate some settlements with its neighbors. For instance, the Camp David agreement that was brokered by President Jimmy Carter in 1979 eventually led to Israel returning the Sinai Peninsula to Egypt, and also later on the Golan Heights. That area, although there still remains Israel settlements from Israel built by Israel, but that territory that used to be Syria and a little of Lebanon is now back in the hands of those countries, with Israel having a carved piece of it for Israel. Concerning the West Bank, and I'm going to draw it again because my marker is slowly erasing. Israel still militarily is over and controls the West Bank. However, it is also administered by a Palestinian organization known as the Palestinian Authority. And the Palestinian Authority on a local level is in charge of governing the West Bank, which includes Jerusalem and East Jerusalem, I should say, as well, where the Palestinians, they pay taxes to the Palestinian Authority, and they vote in elections concerning the Palestinian Authority on a local level. But they are not, the Palestinians living here are not citizens of Israel, where they cannot vote in the national elections. And here, the Gaza Strip, which is also, this has become part, the two of them are really known as Palestine, and they're both administered by the Palestinian Authority until 2007, when an Arab group known as the Hamas came, and it was a grassroots militant organization, and took control of the Gaza Strip. And really, the Gaza Strip is now controlled by Hamas, which still in some ways has a relationship with the Palestinian Authority. But Israel now recognizes and Hamas over the Gaza Strip, as with most of the other nations of the world. So I went to a bookstore a few blocks away from the hotel to get a better map. This is a more extensive map of Israel. And as I move toward the conclusion of this video clipping, I just want to again circle two areas specifically. This is known as the West Bank, and then the Gaza Strip, which is right here. And these two areas now really form what is known as Palestine. It is a somewhat of a government. It is recognized as an observer in the United Nations, has not been given full status as a state or as a nation. But Israel also recognizes these two areas of Palestine. In some ways, militarily, it is somewhat controlled still by Israel, but at the same time, these two territories, known as one Palestine, has its own local governance known as the Palestinian Authority. Most of the people who live in these areas are Palestinians, and a vast majority of them are Muslims. There are some Jews who live in these areas, particularly outside of Gaza and a little within Gaza, and they are Israeli citizens. They can vote, but not the Palestinians, who really, if you ask, and I had the opportunity to speak to a number of Palestinians, both in the West Bank and the Gaza, and just about universally, they said that if they had their choice of becoming an Israeli citizen, they would prefer not to, because to become an Israeli citizen is to acknowledge the state of Israel, which they will not do, because they still contend that Israel should not have been taken, or the Palestine, which used to be all of this, should not have been taken from them in 1948. Before I go, I do want to focus particularly on the Gaza Strip, and which is here, right on the shore of the Mediterranean Sea. Most of you are aware that this is where much of the recent conflicts have taken place. The people of the Gaza Strip, which is controlled and governed by the Hamas, versus Israel. And just last week, over the weekend, there were some missile rockets that were fired from Israel onto the Gaza Strip, as Israel claimed that they were doing it just to preempt some attacks that were slated to occur within days from the Gaza Strip. And the Gaza Strip also responded with some missiles launched and aimed along some of the areas of Israel, going even into Jerusalem and then into Tel Aviv. But none of those missiles reached those designated cities where the Hamas, I'm sorry, not the Hamas, but the Islamic Jihad movement, which is another grassroots organization that launched and had planned to attack Israel. Again, its purpose and its hope was to one day, to begin this movement of killing or eliminating Israel, so that the Palestinian people would once again have their land. Of course, this 2 or 3 day movement, which involved dozens of people being killed, including children, and again, this happened just this weekend. There was a ceasefire that Egypt was able to help broker. The Hamas actually was not involved in this military operation. They did not want to be involved in it. It was strictly the Islamic Jihad movement, which is a grassroots movement that is somehow they have parallel goals and aspirations with the Hamas, but they're a separate organization. And they were the ones that fought, not actually fought, but they were the ones that were involved in the conflict with Israel over the past weekend. And again, it occurred over a stretch of 2 to 3 days, and then there was a ceasefire. So this is Israel, the map, and it looks kind of extensive. But, Israel, as many geographers have noted, is is the size of New Jersey. So it's not really a vast land like Saudi Arabia and other countries in the Middle East. But it is a country that has been burdened for over 70 years with conflicts that continue, battles that will go on, and unfortunately, and hopefully not, but perhaps more wars against the Palestinian people and the Arab nations who are solidly against Israel being Israel. So my Charles Street family, as I end this series of video clippings, I hope the series was a blessing to you. I hope that it was of value to you. And I want to first take this opportunity to thank you for your attention, for your support. And I also want to thank you for your prayers, for my safe journey, for your love. I deeply treasure your love and your prayers, and I'm truly thankful to God for you. I love you all. This is something that I wanted to do as a gift to you. I'm appreciative of the Jewish Community Relations Council of Greater Boston that financially sponsored this trip, was able to take care of all of my expenses so that I wouldn't have to go to you, my church, for any financial support. So thank you, JCRC. Thank you, Reverend Barbara. Thank you. I love you. Can't wait to see you. Jeremy and Angelo and G-Man and little Anna, to all of my Charles Street family. I want to thank my presiding elder, the Reverend Jocelyn Hot Lovelace, for your support, for your prayers, for everything in every way that you supported. You kept in touch with me. You kept in touch with Reverend Washington. I want to thank Bishop McAllister for also calling in, praying with us, and supporting us as well. I want to thank the gift of the Reverend Dr. Ellis Washington. I was asked to stay behind for 2 weeks so that he would not be alone, but truly this time has been a wonderful 14 days of two brothers bonding even deeper. Two brothers who met each other some 40 years ago at Morehouse, were friends then, became friends over the years, but these 14 days we will always cherish together. So God bless you all. I'll be on the airplane in a short while, flying across the Atlantic, returning home to Boston. Can't wait, but I thank God for this time in Israel. I know it was God's will. I want to thank Reverend Caden Nurse for producing the clippings and organizing them in a way that they were presented to you in a way that hopefully was of ministry. And I want to thank Linda Deutsch, my secretary and church secretary, and who also was the chief anchor woman for this video clipping. So I'm signing off now. God bless you all. Reverend Greg Groover from WCS A.M.E. And now, finally, at last, back to you, Linda.